Good morning, Year 7. This is Miss Murdoch, and I'll be taking you through your first lesson, your remote lesson on poetry, which is looking at the poem The Drum by John Scott. What I want you to do for your do now is to copy out the paragraph which tells you a little bit about the poem that we're going to read today and to correct the mistakes. So add any where you think there should be capital letters, include or change punctuation, and check for any spelling mistakes. So pause the video here and write out that paragraph. Obviously, if you want to do the STAR challenge, that's around answering these questions. Would you join the military to support your country if there was a war? Why or why not? Okay, so following your initial work last week and whatever you did on Monday, you may have guessed that this term we will be reading and studying texts and poems that link to conflict and war. Conflict and war have two different definitions. Basically, a conflict is an active disagreement between people with opposing ideas or principles. So you could get involved in a conflict. You might have a disagreement with someone, and you might have a totally different idea to what they have. War is something different. This is where we have armed fighting, and that's usually between two or more countries or communities of people. Why are we studying this? Obviously, to help widen our understanding of issues that had or have a serious impact on people's lives, whether that's in the history or even current day times. Also, we're looking to develop our skills in exploring poetry, which will help us when we come to move on to our GCSEs, and how poets express their ideas and feelings. And through this, hopefully, we will start to look at poetry, we will start to analyse some of the language that poets use, and maybe write some of our own poems, which I've already seen some lovely poems from my class. So today we will be reading The Drum, and we will explore the language used. To be successful for this, you must listen as I read the poem and pay attention to it. Pick out any key quotes that you understand you could use to write P paragraphs. So this is more around picking out the quotes that you think describe the war and maybe how the poet is thinking about war, what his feelings are towards war. So before I do read the poem, I just want to go through just some of the vocabulary that's used in it, because some of the words might be unfamiliar to you. Okay, discordant, in this instance, is talking about sound, and it means it's out of tune. Yields, produces or provides. You could think about yields is also another definition for yields is give way to something, so give way to someone. But in this instance, in the poem, it's produces or provides. Tawdry is cheap or tacky. Ravaged, severely damaged. Swains is an old poetic word for young men. Mangled is destroyed by crushing or tearing. And bestows is to give or to bring something to someone else. So, listen while I read out the poem. Remember, pick out any quotes that you think maybe tell you a little bit about how John Scott maybe felt about war. I hate that drum's discordant sound, parading round and round and round. To thoughtless youth it pleasure yields, and lures from cities and from fields, to sell their liberty for charms of tawdry lace and glittering arms, and when ambition's voice commands, to fight and fall in foreign lands. I hate that drum's discordant sound, parading round and round and round. To me it talks of ravaged plains, and burning towns and ruined swains, and mangled limbs and dying groans, and widows' tears and orphans' moans, and all that misery's hand bestows to fill a catalogue of woes. Okay, so what I want you to do, thinking about the poem now, I want you to answer some of the following questions and identify some quotes from the poem to support your answer. So question 1 is, what quote in line 4 implies that young men are called to join the war from the countryside and big towns? Question 2, what quote in line 8 suggests that the men that join will probably die far away from home? Question 3, what quote in line 9 implies that the poet might not like war? Question 4. What quote from lines 12 to 13 suggests that war can be destructive and terrible? And question 5. What quote in line 14 implies that war kills husbands and fathers? If you do finish those and get on to the Star Challenge, that is, in your poem, underline 2 quotes that you think most powerfully show that war can be terrible. What does each one suggest? Why is war terrible? And make notes. Pause the video here and complete your tasks. Okay, these are the answers that I came up with from those questions. So the first one was, what quote in line 4 implies that young men are called to join the war from the countryside and big towns? And that is lures from cities and from fields. Lures means persuading or enticing, encouraging someone to follow you, basically. So cities obviously would be the big towns and fields is the countryside. Number 2, what quote in line 8 suggests that the men that join will probably die far away from home? That is fall in foreign lands. So fall in this case would mean they'd fall to their death and they would end up lying on foreign lands, so they wouldn't be in their own country. What quote in line 9 implies that the poet might not like war? He says, and repeats this from line 1 really, I hate that drum's discordant sound. So he hates the sound of the drum because it's meaning that it's calling even more young men to war, and he knows that a lot of them will die. Number 4, what quote from lines 12 to 13 suggests that war can be destructive and terrible? Obviously, that's talking about the burning towns, the ruined swains, meaning the ruined young men, mangled limbs, obviously these limbs are destroyed, and dying groans, so the sad sound of people groaning as they're dying. And then number 5, what quote in line 14 implies that war kills husbands and fathers? And widows' tears and orphans' moans. Obviously, a widow would lose her husband and the orphans would lose their father. If you haven't identified these, then take a few moments to write them down so that you've got some key quotes that you can explore when we come to do the piece paragraph in your next lesson. Your next task, Year 7, is to think about some of the quotes, obviously, that we've now looked at. Consider, how does the poet present feelings about war? So what I want you to do is I want you to write a chart as the one that's on your screen now, and I want you to make your point. So the poet presents the feeling that war is what? What do you think the poet feels about war? Use evidence from the text. So this is shown in the quote. So pick out a quote. Explore that quote. What does that quote say? This implies what? And then, if you can, take up the Star Challenge, zoom in, look deeper. The poet has used the word, and then pick out a specific word from your quote, which also implies what. To be successful, I expect all of you to find 2 quotes to explore. Some of you might want to move on and to get higher marks, find 3 quotes to explore. Think of a detailed explanation for your explore, 12 plus words long, and select a word from your quote to zoom in on. Pause the video here and draw your chart and pick out your point, evidence, explore. Okay, just to give you an example of what I found, I picked out that the poet, I think, presents the feeling that war is horrific, frightening, scary even. I picked out one key quote, so that's shown in the quote, mangled limbs and dying groans, because the image of that is quite horrific. It implies obviously pain and horrible death, and then I thought I could probably zoom in on the word mangled to actually support that even further. So hopefully you've picked out some key points, evidence, and explore that a bit further. And I'm hoping some of you will have found the zoom in. Your final task for today is think about, we're talking still about how the poet presents the feelings about war. War made people feel. So I want you to do a quick mind map, or you can bullet point if you want to, and pick out some of the words that are below as to what you think war made people feel. How do people feel about war? Were they hopeful about war? Were they happy about it? And if you can then, as a Star Challenge, find a quote from the poem that links to each feeling you add, that would be exceptional work. Obviously, also, if you can find any other words that you think might be appropriate to put in your mind map or your bullet point list, then by all means add them. That's the end of the lesson for today, and we will use what we've done today in our next lesson to actually create our P's paragraphs. Thank you, Year 7, and goodbye.